I spent 5 nights in county jail after getting arrested for a DUI when I was 26. It wasn't because I crashed into anyone or hurt somebody. I got pulled over after leaving a friend's birthday party because I convinced myself I was okay to drive. I wasn't. Looking back, it was one of the dumbest decisions I've ever made, and I spent the next several days regretting it. The first 4 nights were exactly what you'd expect. They were uncomfortable, embarrassing, and painfully slow. But nothing happened that I'd consider unusual. Most of the time I just kept my head down, avoided conversations, and counted the hours until court. My biggest concern was getting through each day without attracting attention. On the 4th morning, my cellmate was released. For the first time since I arrived, I had the cell to myself. Honestly, it was the best night's sleep I'd had since being booked. No snoring, no pacing, no awkward small talk, just silence. That didn't last long. A little after 1 in the morning on my 5th night, I woke up to the sound of keys rattling outside my cell. The overhead lights in the housing unit were never completely turned off, so everything had this dull gray glow that made it impossible to tell what time it was without looking at the clocks in the hallway. The steel door slid open. One of the deputies looked inside. "Sit up!" Still half asleep, I thought maybe they were moving me to another housing unit. Instead, he stepped aside. "You're getting a new cellmate." Standing behind him was a man I'd never seen before. He looked somewhere in his late 40s. His Orange County-issued jumpsuit hung loosely off him like he'd recently lost a lot of weight. His shoulders were slumped, and his head stayed angled toward the floor the entire time. The deputy uncuffed him, removed the restraints, and shut the cell door. The man never acknowledged me. Not once. Without saying a word, he climbed onto the top bunk, turned toward the concrete wall, pulled the thin jail blanket over himself, and became completely still. I figured he was exhausted. People got booked into county at all hours of the night. Maybe he'd been arrested only an hour earlier. Maybe he'd just gotten bad news. Whatever the reason, I didn't think much of it. I introduced myself anyway. "Hey, I'm Ryan." Nothing, not even in glance. I waited a few seconds. "You all right?" Still nothing. He didn't move. He didn't sigh. He didn't even adjust the blanket. After a minute, I gave up. Some people just wanted to be left alone. I rolled over, pulled my blanket up, and eventually drifted back to sleep. I don't know how much later it was when something woke me again. At first I thought someone farther down the block was talking in their sleep. Then I realized it wasn't talking. Someone was crying. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It sounded like someone trying as hard as they could not to let anyone hear them. I slowly opened my eyes. The man was sitting on the edge of the top bunk. His back was still facing me. His shoulders trembled every few seconds. He never once turned around. For a while I just listened. It felt wrong to interrupt him. Eventually I quietly asked, "Hey, are you okay?" No response. The crying continued. A minute later I asked again. Still nothing. For almost 10 minutes he remained exactly like that. Head lowered, facing the wall, quietly crying into the darkness. Then, it stopped. Not gradually. Instantly. He slowly lay back down, pulled the blanket over himself again, and became perfectly still. I remember thinking maybe he'd just received terrible news before being arrested. Eventually I fell asleep again. Around 6 that morning, the breakfast carts started rolling through the block. The deputy unlocked my cell. He looked inside, then immediately looked back at me. "Who are you talking to?" I laughed. "My cellmate." His expression never changed. "What cellmate?" I pointed toward the top bunk. "He's right there." The deputy stepped into the cell. The bunk was empty. The blanket was folded neatly. There wasn't a wrinkle on the mattress. I honestly thought he was messing with me. "What are you talking about? You brought him in here last night." Another deputy walked over. They checked the housing assignment. Then they checked the electronic door log. After a minute, one of them looked directly at me. Nobody was assigned to this cell overnight. I argued with them for several minutes. I described everything. "When you brought him in, he climbed to the top bunk. He never spoke. He stayed facing the wall." The first deputy suddenly interrupted me. "He never turned around?" I shook my head. "No." The deputy stared at me for several long seconds, then quietly asked, Did he sit on the edge of the bunk while he was crying? I nodded. Yeah. The color drained from his face. Without another word, he stepped into the hallway and quietly closed the cell door. A couple of hours later, another inmate passed my cell on the way back from recreation. I asked if he'd seen the man who'd been assigned to me overnight. He frowned. What'd he look like? I don't know, I admitted. I never saw his face. The inmate stared at me, then asked. He stayed facing the wall the whole time. I nodded. He looked away for a second, before quietly saying, I would have kept pretending to sleep. Then he kept walking. I never got the chance to ask what he meant. I was released later that afternoon. I've never been back to that jail. I still don't know who or what spent that night in my cell, but every once in a while, usually around 3 in the morning, I'll wake up for no reason at all, and for just a second, I can still hear someone quietly from the bunk above me. I was about 3 weeks into a 6-month sentence at a county jail after getting convicted of a non-violent offense. By that point, I'd settled into the routine. As strange as it sounds, jail becomes predictable after a while. Breakfast came at the same time every morning. Lights went out at the same time every night, and every day felt almost identical to the one before it. My cellmate had been transferred to another housing unit that afternoon, so for the first time in weeks I had the cell to myself. I remember thinking I might actually get a decent night's sleep. That lasted until about 11 o'clock. I heard keys jingling outside the door. A deputy opened the cell and escorted another inmate inside. The guy immediately caught my attention. He wasn't angry. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't yelling like a lot of new arrivals. He looked terrified. Not nervous. Terrified. His eyes were bloodshot like he hadn't slept in days, and he kept glancing over his shoulder into the hallway, even after the deputy removed his handcuffs. The deputy pointed to the empty top bunk. That's yours. The man quietly climbed the ladder without saying a word. The deputy shut the door behind him. Just before the officer walked away, the new guy suddenly leaned over the railing and looked down at me for the first time. His voice was barely above a whisper. Whatever happens tonight. He paused. Don't answer if someone knocks. I actually laughed. What? He looked toward the cell door before answering. Just don't. That was it. He climbed back onto the top bunk, turned toward the wall, and pulled the blanket over himself. I figured he was mentally unstable. County jail wasn't exactly known for stable people. About an hour later, I was lying awake when I heard it. 3 slow knocks. Knock. 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 They weren't coming from the cell door. They came from somewhere behind my bunk. The sound echoed through the concrete wall. At first I thought another inmate was messing around in the neighboring cell. I looked toward the top bunk. My new cellmate hadn't moved. I whispered, "Did you hear that?" Without turning around, he quietly answered, "I told you, don't answer." His voice sounded different now, not angry, not threatening, just exhausted. A few minutes passed. Then, 3 more knocks, exactly the same. Knock, knock, knock. This time another inmate farther down the block answered. Yeah? Silence. The entire housing unit went quiet. 5, maybe 6 seconds later, someone started screaming. Not yelling, not shouting. Screaming. The kind of scream that instantly tells you something is horribly wrong. It echoed through the entire block. Officers came running. Doors slammed. People started shouting over each other. Then, the screaming stopped. Just like that. It was so sudden it almost sounded like someone had covered the man's mouth. The rest of the night was chaos. Nobody slept. Deputies were walking back and forth for hours. The next morning everyone was asking what had happened. Nobody got a straight answer. The inmate who screamed was gone. Some people said he'd been transferred. Others claimed medical staff had taken him away. No one seemed to know. Or if they did, they weren't talking. My cellmate barely spoke the entire day. He skipped breakfast, ignored lunch, spent almost every hour sitting on the top bunk facing the wall. Late that evening, after recreation, I finally worked up the courage to ask him, "What happened in your last cell?" For a long time he didn't answer. I thought maybe he hadn't heard me. Finally, without looking back, he quietly said, because they knocked there too. I frowned. They? He slowly shook his head. I never saw anyone. That answer bothered me more than if he'd said it was another inmate. After lights out, the knocking returned. This time it came from our cell door. 3 slow knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Neither of us moved. A deputy eventually walked past during his security rounds. He looked directly at our door, then looked at us, sitting perfectly still. Without saying a word, he kept walking, like he hadn't heard anything at all. The knocking continued every 15 or 20 minutes until sunrise. Always 3 knocks. Never a voice. Never footsteps. Never anyone standing outside. The next afternoon, my cellmate was unexpectedly transferred. No explanation, no goodbye. He gathered his few belongings and quietly followed the deputy out of the cell. I never saw him again. That night, I lay awake waiting. Part of me hoped the knocking had left with him. It hadn't. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the wall. It wasn't coming from the door. It came from directly underneath my bunk. 3 slow knocks, right beneath where I was lying. I pulled my feet up without even thinking. I didn't move another muscle. I didn't answer. I barely even breathed. The knocking happened twice more before morning. Then it stopped. 4 months later, I was released. I tried convincing myself the whole thing had been some strange jail rumor that got inside my head. About a year after I got out, I ran into one of the correctional officers who had worked that housing unit. After talking for a few minutes, I finally asked him if he remembered all the strange knocking that used to happen at night. He looked at me strangely. Then he asked one question. "Your cellmate warned you not to answer, didn't he?" I stared at him. "Yeah." He slowly nodded. Every inmate who ever reported the knocking said the same thing. I asked him what happened to that guy, the one they transferred. The officer stayed quiet for several seconds. Then he looked me straight in the eyes and said, "There wasn't any transfer." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He quietly replied, "There was never a record that anyone was assigned to your cell." He paused. "We've checked more than once." I didn't know what to say. Then he added one final sentence that still keeps me awake some nights. "You're not the first inmate who says someone warned them, and you're not the first one who remembers a cellmate that never existed." When I was 22, I got arrested after a bar fight outside a sports bar. It wasn't some huge brawl where half the place got involved. It was just one stupid argument that got out of hand after everyone had been drinking. By the time the police showed up, all they really saw were 2 guys throwing punches in the parking lot. I spent the weekend in county jail waiting to see a judge Monday morning. It was my first time ever being arrested. I'd never even gotten so much as a speeding ticket before that night. The first 24 hours were miserable. I barely slept. I barely ate. I just wanted to get out. By Sunday afternoon, everyone in my housing unit seemed to know I was the new guy. Most of the inmates ignored me, but one older guy struck up a conversation while we were sitting in the day room. He wasn't intimidating. If anything, he looked tired. He asked what I was in for. I told him the truth. "A bar fight." He nodded. Then he asked if my family knew where I was. I told him my parents had already called an attorney and were planning to post bail Monday morning. The man's expression changed immediately. He leaned closer and quietly said, "Don't tell anybody when your family's posting bail." I laughed. "Why?" He shrugged. "Just don't." Before I could ask what he meant, an officer called everyone back to their cells. I didn't think much about the conversation after that. The next morning, I woke up expecting to see a judge sometime before lunch. Around 9 o'clock, someone stopped outside my cell. I looked up expecting a deputy. Instead, I saw a man wearing khakis, a button-up shirt, and a dark windbreaker. He definitely wasn't dressed like jail staff. He smiled when he saw me. "You must be Tyler." I stood up. "Yeah?" He held up a clipboard. "Your dad hired me. I'm with the bail bonds office." I felt this huge wave of relief. Finally, someone was here to get me out. He asked me to step closer to the bars while we waited for the paperwork to finish. At first, the questions seemed completely normal. "Your parents still at the same address?" "Yeah." "You living with them?" "For now." "What kind of car do you drive?" "A Civic." "Still working construction?" I nodded. Then the questions became stranger. You keep anything valuable at home? I laughed awkwardly. What? Firearms? Cash? Any expensive watches or jewelry? I figured maybe this was somehow related to the bond paperwork. I'd never been arrested before. How was I supposed to know what questions were normal? So I answered, not everything, but enough. After about 20 minutes, he smiled. Shouldn't be much longer. Then he walked away. About 10 minutes later, a deputy came to my cell. He unlocked the door. You ready? I grabbed my property bag. As we started walking, I asked, the bail bonds guy already left? The deputy stopped. What bail bonds guy? The one talking to me. He looked confused. What are you talking about? The guy in the windbreaker. He had a clipboard. He said my dad hired him. The deputy stared at me for several seconds, then asked, where was he standing? Outside my cell. The deputy's face immediately changed. He looked down the hallway, then back at me. Bail agents are never allowed inside housing. I felt my stomach drop. What do you mean? They stay in the public lobby. They don't come back here. He immediately started asking which deputy had escorted the man inside. I told him nobody had. The man had simply walked up to my cell. The deputy didn't say another word. He hurried me toward processing. An hour later, my dad picked me up. I asked him about the bail bondsman during the drive home. He looked confused. What bail bondsman? The one you hired. I didn't hire one. Our attorney handled everything. For the rest of the drive, neither of us spoke much. I kept replaying the conversation in my head. 3 nights later, around 10 o'clock, someone rang our front doorbell. I looked through the peephole. Standing on the porch was the same man, same windbreaker, same clipboard tucked under one arm, same smile. I didn't open the door. Instead, I asked, what do you want? He chuckled. I forgot to ask your dad something. I didn't answer. He leaned a little closer to the door. Where does he keep the gun safe? Every hair on my arm stood up. I backed away and immediately called 911. By the time officers arrived, he was gone. No vehicle, no witnesses, nothing. For weeks after that, every unfamiliar car that drove slowly past our house made me nervous. I started checking the locks every night before going to bed. Months later, I learned something that still bothers me. I ran into the same older inmate who had warned me in the day room. He had been arrested again. When he recognized me, he only asked one question. He come to your house? I nodded. He sighed. I figured. I asked him who the man was. He slowly shook his head. I don't know. Then he looked me straight in the eyes and said, every few years somebody in here talks to a man who says he's from the bail bonds office. I asked what happened to those people. He looked away for a moment before answering. Some of them never see him again. He paused. But the unlucky ones answer the door.